Thanks for staying with us here on The Real Story. We're talking about the races on your ballot and how they impact our state budget and, in turn, your family. We caught up with the state's Comptroller, Scanlan. Take a look. We've been talking so much in the past couple weeks, and I think months at this point, about this very important, very unique presidential race. But of course, there are so many other important congressional races and down ballot, whether it's state legislative all the way to even some municipal posts that are on the ballots as well. Our legislature's makeup, both state and federal, could really change with this election. And you have a perspective on just, how big this could be right now, because next state legislative session 2025 is a budget year and you handle the state finances. So just tell me right now, how it's been feeling during this election season.
Well, listen, the national race gets all the attention,
right?
But there are probably 10 or 15 elections here in Connecticut for state senate and state representative that will come down to less than 100 votes, if not sometimes a handful of votes. And so I tell people all the time, yes, the oxygen is with the federal race, but pay attention to your local state rep race, because every race from president to probate judge has an impact on your community and has an impact on the issues that you care about. Engage in those races. Find out who your candidates are, and don't just vote for president and walk out. Go all the way down the ballot and vote for the candidates that you think are best suited to represent you.
And we know now this year, this is the first general election with early voting. So a lot of people I talked to in the past few weeks since it started have already voted, which is really exciting. Before I get into some more of those impacts, how are the, Connecticut's finances right now? What is the state of the state's finances looking like? Because we know we've been on the up and up the past couple times we've chatted about this.
10 years ago, Connecticut was in a permanent fiscal crisis. And thanks to reforms that we put in place on a bipartisan basis in 2017, Connecticut is now in a position where our fiscal health has never been healthier. We've got 6 consecutive years of ending our budget with a surplus. We have paid down $8.5 billion of pension debt, and we have a rainy day fund that is full for the first time in the history of Connecticut. When you compare our fiscal success with what's happening economically, lowest unemployment rate since 2001, inflation cooling, wage growth up, we're sort of primed to have continued fiscal and budget success going forward. And I think the big challenge of this General Assembly that will be elected in this year's election will be, how can we find the balance between continuing our fiscal progress and meeting the needs of today? And I look forward as the Comptroller to working with them and the governor to find that balance.
And we know that has been a difficult balance to strike. It's been part of the conversation, at the very least for the last 2 legislative sessions, of a lot of people saying, well, the state has all this money left over. Why aren't we seeing a little bit more relief? But obviously we saw this past session, the fiscal guardrails were just re-upped, as you said, on a bipartisan basis. We did hear, though, some talk from lawmakers, and as you said, new people who will be voted in, about whether or not this next session should look at, maybe rethinking or reworking those fiscal guardrails. What's your position on that?
I think everyone from the most progressive Democrat to the most conservative Republican is not saying we should get rid of the guardrails. I think all of them agree that we have fundamentally taken Connecticut in a much better place.
Right.
It's almost as if we have a good problem to have, which is, are we saving too much money, right? That is not where we were 10 years ago. And so what I tell people all the time is, I think we have found a good balance so far, and we ended the fiscal crisis that we were in, which is the main part of what those guardrails were all about. Now what we need to do is figure out what the next iteration of Connecticut wants to be.
Right.
And I do think we can continue finding that balance between the needs of yesterday and the needs of today. What I'll also say to you is that we are lucky that the federal monetary policy in this country has attained what's called the soft landing. That basically means that we cooled inflation without messing up our jobs market. And that was what Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve have been trying to do for 2 years.
Right.
It's very painful. Our interest rates remain high for way too long. Inflation was a reality for our lives for a long time. Now, inflation has finally cooled to where it is supposed to be from an economics perspective, and we're seeing wage growth is outpacing inflation. So that means more people have money in their pocket, and the things that they go and buy at the grocery store are not as expensive. That's a good thing for people. And if we can continue along those lines, it's a good thing for our state.
And we know on a federal level, this conversation is not just about all the state money that's, sitting in the rainy day fund right now. It's also federal funding, which has come in and been used right away. We know a little bit of the issue a couple years ago was some of those COVID era, pandemic funds running out. But Connecticut has also been the recipient of millions of dollars for various state grants, education, industry, infrastructure. The Biden administration has been huge for a lot of those projects here and working really closely with our federal congressional delegation. But during this election cycle, we've heard a lot, especially from Republican campaigns, about across the board spending cuts being, a core part of their messaging. What does your office plan for? Do you look at those conversations? Are there any fears if there were to be cuts to some of those federal grants and programs that we know Connecticut receives a lot of money from?
Well, first of all, there's a big misconception out there that Connecticut's fiscal success in the last few years is only because we got $3 billion of COVID money.
Right.
The numbers just don't add up, right? I gave you the numbers a minute ago. We've got $8.5 billion of pension debt paid down. We've got $4 billion in the rainy day fund, and we've kept our budget, which is $26 billion, going for the last 6 years.
Right.
Obviously, $3 billion of federal money didn't help all that happen. Was it helpful? Sure. But that money is gone. And now we are expressing a period of time where we don't really know who is going to be in the White House and whether we'll continue to see federal money for things like our roads and our bridges and our highways, the kind of things that we rely on from the federal government. So I know our governor and the legislature are planning for both options. Obviously, I hope that Kamala Harris is the next president of the United States, because I think under her administration, we will continue to see the kind of funding support that we've seen under President Biden, which has been very, very helpful for us to meet our obligations. But even if President Trump is victorious in this election, we will continue to do everything we can to maximize as much federal resources as we can, but also balance our budget here at home, which is something they don't even have to do in Washington. We do that here. We're leading at the state level. Democrats and Republicans can still work together in Hartford, even though what happens in Washington is a bit of a mess these days.
Yeah, and we know beyond just obligations, it's also, various programs for things like flood relief. Really quickly, what do you hear from residents who are recipients? We know that's under your office purview as well. When you're speaking to people who have been impacted or been the recipients of some of these programs, how are you hearing that some of these federal funds as well as state funds are impacting Connecticut residents?
Look, I'm someone who believes fundamentally that government can make a difference in people's lives. And whether it's state funding or federal funding or a combination thereof, it's about what we can do to help people and make people's lives better. We are doing that right now, whether it's flooding in the north end of Hartford or it's helping people afford prescription drugs, which is something that my office also does. We are always working to try to make life more affordable and better for the people of Connecticut, and federal resources are a big part of that. I'd also say that the federal economy is a big part of how we balance our budget. If people are spending money, if people are making more money, as they have been in the last few years, as while things like inflation make people think that the economy is worse than it is, Wall Street has had one of their best years in a very long time. That's good for Connecticut, and that's why I do think this election is important and will have an impact on us, and my office will continue to follow this very closely and see where we end up.
Yeah, the state's working relationship with who's in office, especially in Washington, definitely has a big impact on finances as well. We've been talking a lot about the economy, and as you've mentioned a couple times, inflation has been a really big topic of all the campaigns, whether it is the presidential or those down ballot races, not just here in Connecticut, but across the country. People were impacted by this for a really long time, and we have seen this be a driver for people to the polls. They're hearing you now saying Connecticut state finances are in a really good position, as well as you said, inflation cooling. But we know some of these changes, whether it, just be policy, just be economic, take a while to really go into effect and for people to really see those impacts. It's a lot of times hard to make that distinction of whose policies are actually impacting what your, financial outlook looks like right now. How do you explain that to residents and people who might be saying, well, the economy was great a few years ago, but don't really know who to point to for the impacts of certain policies?
Yeah, well, it's really hard to explain complicated, wonky fiscal policy versus just saying everything is terrible. Don't you agree with that, right? So we have a challenge in that regard. What I would tell people is this: we're coming out of a 5-year insane period in our history where we had a global pandemic followed by a fiscal crisis and an inflation crisis that was the worst we've seen in a generation. It is not easy for us to manage all of those things, and we had to make some very hard decisions at both the federal and state level in the last 5 years. But what I think is the result of today is that we have mitigated that pandemic, we have mitigated that fiscal crisis. The supply chain crisis of a few years ago is gone. Inflation is back to under 3%, which is what economists tell you it should be at. Wage growth is up. Unemployment is the lowest it's been since before 9/11. These are all big things that maybe people don't feel because they still feel like things are a little more expensive than they should be. But over time, the fiscal policies that we have put in place are working. It is not easy to put on a bumper sticker, but it is what is the reality of our economic situation. And by any marker you look at, whether it's unemployment, wage growth, inflation, we have made big progress, and people will start to feel that gradually. What we need to do now is to try to make Connecticut finally start to see the kind of economic growth that we all want to see. Job growth, business growth, people moving into the state. We started to see that during COVID. Now we have to accelerate that, and a big part of what the governor is trying to do, and a big part of what the next legislative session, in my opinion, will be about, is how do we take this great opportunity to move Connecticut forward. This election is very pivotal in that because I think there's a stark contrast between two different styles here, and I hope that people will evaluate what their candidates are saying, make a decision, and once this election is over, it's time to do the hard work of actually governing.
As we said, really could see a difference here in what the shape of both our state and federal legislature looks like. I'm sure we'll be checking in for the next session, which will be here before we know it. But thank you so much, as always, Comptroller, for helping us break down a little bit and checking in with us.
Good to see you.
Again, in-person early voting is still happening today, and it is the last day. And then, of course, you can register and still vote on Election Day, Tuesday. If you want to get answers from our complete voter guide or watch any of these segments again, you can find that on fox61.com or on the free Fox 61 News app. Have a great rest of your morning, and see you next Sunday, 10 a.m. for post-election analysis.